Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. It's so lovely to have you here once more. For those of you who don't know, my name is Becc. Today I want to share with you about something that I feel is very important in our spiritual community, and that is spiritual ethics and spiritual responsibility in the role of healer, teacher, coach, alternative practitioner, shaman, psychic, whatever your practice is. If you are like me, if we are space holders for healing, for alchemy, and for the highest light to unfold, we really want to ensure that our ethical container, our ethical structure is already set up within us. And we really want that space to be coming from the core of who we are and the core of our highest intention, which may take on different expressions and essences depending on the person, but ultimately they always lead back to love. So to begin with, I want to read you some quotes about the role of teacher from a French philosopher who I love called Montaigne. I'm not sure if that's how you say his name. In this passage, he had like a friend or someone who wrote to him asking for his opinion and guidance and wisdom on how to choose a tutor for his son and how that should be and how that should work. So here are these beginning quotes. I just have my book here. Put that down. Okay. So Montaigne is speaking about the teacher in this sentence here. And he says, "Sometimes he should prepare the way for him, sometimes let him do so for himself. I would not have him start on everything and do all the talking, but give his pupil a turn and listen to him. Socrates, and after him Celsius, made his pupils speak first and then spoke to them. The authority of those who teach is very often a hindrance to those who wish to learn." And that's a quote that he was quoting from Cicero. And he continues and he says, "Our minds never work except on trust. They are bound and controlled by their appetite for another man's ideas. Enslaved and captivated by the authority of his teaching, we have been so subjected to our leading strings that we have lost all freedom of movement. Our vigor and independence are extinct. They never cease to be under guidance." And he says, "The tutor should make his pupil sift everything and take nothing into his head on simple authority or trust. Aristotle's principles must no more be principles with him than those of the Stoics or the Epicureans. Let their various opinions be put before him. He will choose between them if he can. If not, he will remain in doubt. Only fools are certain and immovable." And then he quotes, "It pleases me as much to doubt as to know," by Dante. And then he continues, "The bees steal from this flower and that, but afterwards they turn their pilferings into honey. It is time and marjoram no longer. So the pupil will transform and fuse together the passages that he borrows from others to make of them something entirely his own, that is to say, his own judgment. His education, his labor, and his study have no other aim but to form this." So I read that the other day, and I think it was Spirit preparing me for sharing and talking with you guys. I'm just put my book down. Because it wasn't intentional to read that particular passage. It was just where I was up to. And in that you can hear Montaigne speaking about the importance of letting the pupil develop themselves, letting them have their own process. So to begin with, I would say that that is one thing that we need to consider in our practice of ethics in our community. Letting someone have their own process is very, very important. Understanding the power of he says something along the lines of, we have been trapped in our leading strings. What I notice is that many people want to give their power away, especially at this time with the more confusion and uncertainty that there is, the more that people will seek help, ideally. And that can be a good thing, yet we need to be offering. I really experience in my experience that people sort of, when they're feeling really low or when they're having self-worth issues, which we all have from time to time, they kind of want to give you their power away. They want to give their power away. I sort of felt like people keep trying to give me their power, and I'm like, no, that's yours and that's sacred. And so that's one thing to think about that I think Montaigne is pointing to, is that when people are wounded or in pain, someone could take advantage of that. You're in a higher position, a position of authority, just automatically, even if you're not intending to be, just through placing yourself as the expert or being the healer. You're the one that has the answers, and the client is vulnerable and they have the questions. So this is one factor to talk about, to think about. I also have another quote here that I wanted to offer you from the being Krishnamurti, who was a human here who taught a lot. It was a great spiritual and kind of philosophy teacher, and he's acted as a guide for me at times. And I channeled this when I put to him the question of, as a teacher or just someone with an opinion, how should we approach when someone is sort of sharing something that we know to be, perhaps we know that it is objectively false, or we believe that it is incorrect. And he said this: if someone is sharing or teaching something you do not agree with or believe to be incorrect, do not dominate. Be equanimous, truthful, and genuine. Always support one another's endeavors for truth, and do not try to be the only teacher at the table, for there is always more than one. Give your opinion only when asked for, and encourage inward reflection and spiritual creativity. Krishnamurti. And I just love that. I feel like in every sentence he really answered my question, that if we just speak your truth, just be honest, and encourage and support people's inward reflection regardless of their outcome, their opinion, and regardless of your disagreeing opinion, this is the path for truth. And every man wants to be on that path, and we should support one another. The encouragement to experience spiritual creativity, or to guide towards spiritual creativity, is very important. So again, this is a teacher saying to allow people to have their process, to allow people to follow along their own path, do not dominate. So again, I think that that's another really important thing. So I'm just looking at my notes now. So Spirit was saying that Spirit was saying something very powerful, was saying that people are often irreverent of their sacred power and of their sacredness. So irreverent means to disregard something that is sacred or holy, to not acknowledge it, dismiss it, abuse it, not care about it, dismiss it. And I think that that really summarizes a lot of what happens. Sometimes as a healer, people have forgotten. It's about, what are we remembering and what have we forgotten? People have forgotten who they are. They've forgotten the sacred light that they are. So when they're like that and they're dismissive of themselves, we can either take advantage of that, or we cannot see that, or we can support them to cultivate their remembrance of their reverence. And perhaps that is ultimately what we are doing. We must also be the ones to uphold it for them when they cannot. We uphold it for them, so we revere and honor them, their sacredness, and their path. And we, to the best of our ability, without being controlling or disruptive of their path, do not allow, maybe perhaps a better word is, do not encourage, do not enable them to disregard and to be irreverent of who they are. Spirit was saying that ultimately this is the gift that we can give them. And when Spirit said that, and when I feel it now, I feel like that's the ultimate everything. It's the ultimate thing to remember as a healer, whatever expression of healing you are, a teacher, a coach, a well-being person, a psychic. We must uphold this reverence for them when they cannot, or the parts of themselves that can't because they're in pain. So now I want to share with you guys about an experience that I had being on the client side of things that really informs my current ethical practice and the way that I practice my healing stuff and teaching things as well. And I wanted to also make a note here that it's not about being absolutely perfect and never making a mistake. It's about the fact that we don't currently have a sacred sort of set of ethics that we all kind of go by. And a lot of healing industries, for example, therapy communities of therapists and doctors, they do have these laws, regulations, and or just ethics that they have to abide by. And what these do is keep the client safe. Some of them also keep the practitioner safe, but they're mostly geared to keeping the client safe and to establishing that the relationship is just kept in that professional arena for the highest good of all. And with the spiritual community at the moment, or the healing community, I would say that a lot of that stuff is not sort of, it's disregarded. So we're talking about things like having really strong boundaries with clients, not having dual roles, so not being the girlfriend of your client, not being the romantically involved or sexually involved with clients, because if you think back to what Spirit and I I don't know, was saying, is that people give a lot to you in that position, and that's why and when people get taken advantage of in that way. So a bad person could totally do that, and that's the trouble with that, and that's why people stay in their role. Another thing is blurred boundaries, which staying in the role helps to not do that. But even if you're kind of not full on breaking your role, but you're blurring the boundary between friendship and healer, for example, that can be very damaging for people. And we really just want to make it a point to honor the psychology of attachment. A lot of this is sort of rooted in the psychology of attachment, which is inevitably going to come up in the healing professions. It is just a part of human psychology at the current time, and it's something that we have to be deeply aware of. You have to understand that your clients are going to attach to you if you see them regularly. Regular clients, that tends to happen. Attachment takes a little bit of time to build usually. If you don't take clients and you're just like a famous teacher, not even famous, but you have like a following or something, for whatever reason, people will attach to you from there as well. And with attachment comes emotions, comes sometimes in this position unhealthy adoration, all different unhealthy things people are projecting onto you, and you might project onto people, onto your followers or your client. And this is like part of that attachment thing, and the ego as well can sometimes take control. Because you are in that higher position, your ego might, run a bit wild and wanna just take advantage or say yes to that person that's throwing money at you, even though you know it's unhealthy, for example. you have to return to the higher ethical truth within you, the higher love within you. But to explain all this further, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. This is also going to be a little bit about just sort of about trauma, just because that's the relationship that I had. And that, I mean, that was something for me that happens with me. You're going to see it as a key feature. And also that the sort of role that trauma is playing in our healing circles is where I'm seeing the most problems and the most damage happening. So it's really important. So in approximately 2016, approximately mid 2016, I was having a very difficult time at that point. My trauma from my past came up in quite a strong way, in quite a flooding way all at once. This can happen when people have been dissociated as a protective measure within their own mind from their trauma. And then when it suddenly becomes, or if it does become safe enough, or you become strong enough, resourced enough within yourself for your trauma for your being to begin to process more deeper things safely, your mind can kind of create a bit of a flood. It happens sometimes for people that have extensive trauma. The dissociation starts to soften, and so it can feel like a flood. And so that's what happened with me. So at that time, and a tiny bit previous to that time, I had been, doing healing stuff just on sort of more, I'm just speaking of myself as a client, right? So like my own processing was just like dabbling in different spiritual things, inner child things, healing all the things, for like 5 or 10 years. I don't know, like my whole life, right? This is just like what I do. um, but so that meant that I had, interactions with spiritual teachers, spiritual healers, etc. And I'm just going to speak briefly, like some of them, I can look at them now and I point to them now because they were unhealthy. So one thing is like becoming close or crossing that healer friendship barrier or protective boundary. Um, and that actually really caused a lot of devastation. There was, a loss of attachment and a damage to my attachment system in a couple of those connections. Um, and that was even before the big crash that I mentioned. So that happened, and that wasn't good. Um, but then in 2016, I had all this stuff come up, and I was at a time where I was surrounded by people who were basically saying to me, like, this is the way to heal trauma, like, this is the way to do it. And so I didn't know that it wasn't the right way. I do take ownership that in all of our difficult situations, there is a part of ourself that is giving the power away or being in denial about a truth. We do take part when we're manipulated. There's a part of us always taking part for that. So I do honor that I, in many instances, was giving my power away. And so I honor that as my role in things. But yeah, at the same time, I was in a very vulnerable state, and that is not to cancel out or confuse or disrupt the responsibility placed on the healers or teachers or whoever, right? Just because we can see that. So I had this flood come up, and I had people telling me this is the way to do it. So I went about doing those processes. And these processes actually were not good for me. They really just opened up more and more. I'm talking about in-depth trauma processing techniques that I now know, and I say to you today and to everyone today, the only person who can hold space for and treat in-depth complex trauma in an in-depth way is a trained professional. So a trained psychotherapist, psychologist, trauma counselor, whatever word is for that, some psychiatrists, things like that. The deeper processing needs to be done with them. spiritual techniques and other sort of stuff can be really helpful and really supportive to the process. And you can do some processing with yourself and certain techniques, or a facilitator of some of that trauma. But a lot of the deeper processing has to be done with a professional. Again, that's my opinion. You may go really strict the other way, and I think that that would be the safer option than going really loose the other way, if that makes sense. And I say this from first-hand experience. So I was doing these in-depth spiritual kind of trauma processing processes that actually were making me worse, because what they were doing was actually opening up and kind of flooding my system with too much too soon. So when you start going towards your pain, your shadow, you're giving your mind and your being permission, finally to stop it being in the unconscious. You're bringing your consciousness, your awareness to what has previously been unconscious. And so when you do that, you're starting to reveal to yourself truth. And that's a process of healing, and we need to do that. But in significant trauma, which I had, you have to do that very slowly and in a controlled way. If you do that too fast, someone like me will get really flooded by the trauma, and it will become very hard for them to manage to function in life. The previous disconnection that you have from trauma like that, what is kept in your unconscious mind is done out of love and protection for your own well-being. Your brain's doing that because it said, this is too much for right now. Let's process this when we have more stability, more resources, a better sense of connection and trust with myself, whatever your life is needing to feel and work on before you would actually be able to manage that and go through it efficiently and process it accurately. So I was hurtling towards the trauma, getting a lot coming up, and I was told to just keep going, just keep going. And that was actually making things worse and worse because it was too much too soon. And there is nothing wrong with going towards your trauma and doing in-depth processing if you are also being told or being, guided by a professional and practicing coping skills and the ability to emotionally regulate, to self-soothe, these kinds of skills, the ability to wrap up and put away trauma that you don't quite have the energy to treat right now, or it's not the right time for you to look at it, things like that. These are skills that a trained professional will ensure that their client has set up and they've learned before they'll even let them go towards, deeper trauma. Obviously, sometimes the trauma might just come up and they have to go toward it, but it's wrapped in this kind of, you need to have balance, you need to regulate your nervous system, things like this. So without that, I was just getting flooded and flooded and flooded, and things got very dark very quickly. It was probably the worst time in my adult life because I was facing so much. There was a lot of grief, there was a lot of loss, just in the full awareness of everything. And because there was no gate, no stopping with that, I had many periods where I was really suicidal. And that's your system, well before that though, but that's your system saying like, this is too much pain for me to handle, But the people that I was around had, as Krishnamurti mentioned about domination, they had a kind of dominating effect on me and the other people who were also in the same boat, where there's a really strong message of this is the way, this is the path, and there was a lack of encouragement to explore other things, a lack of encouragement, even just gentle pointing to connect with one's heart, to connect and balance things with the light. Those coping skills I mentioned, such as soothing, regulation. Grounding is a huge thing if you have trauma coming up. So that's the ability to be present in the here and now, otherwise known these days as mindfulness. That's actually a form of grounding. The one at least where you listen to all the senses and you hear the birds and you feel your breath and your eyes open. Yeah, so that's a really key thing for helping your body understand I'm safe now to process this and to actually let yourself process something. Without it, you're not processing properly. You may be feeling the feeling or the trauma or the pain, and without it being presently held with by your conscious awareness and your presence awareness within your window of tolerance, as a therapist would say, you are not going to process it properly. Instead, you're actually just flooding your system and kind of reliving the experience in an ungrounded way, and that's it. And energetically, you're actually feeding the energies and patterns and things that are there. What transmutes, what transforms is presence, is that part of the light of awareness of the higher self or the heart that is presence. And presence within your window of tolerance, so you're still regulated as you go. So that totally happened and it was terrible, and I ended up realizing that I was kind of like getting sick, like I was kind of like spiritually unwell. It was just a knowing that I ended up having with me, and it was happening, was like that it was hard to feel my light. It was hard to feel my light. And if you're in that boat, I need you to know that you're not supposed to have such a hard time feeling your light as well, even going through a difficult time. We do have periods, extended periods, if you're in a dark night of the soul or depression and things like that. But we want there to be flickers of light. Okay, we want there to be self-care and nurturing as best as you can through that experience. So for me, I was really wanting to feel better, right? And I was really attached to, I should say here, not attached, I really wanted deeply in me to feel peace, which I do now, and I'm so grateful. And this is part of what I mean if you guys ever hear me saying, like, I never thought I would get here, because I was so far the opposite. It was so far the opposite. So I continued to do these sort of practices that weren't actually working for me, with the promise that it would get better, without coping skills, etc. Things did get a little bit better when I found a therapist who was very concerned about what we were doing, but and this was a very wise thing, and I'll mention it, kept their opinion to themselves until I had formed my own opinion. And I say that because it formed a stepping stone or a block or a foundation of safety and trust that I had never known before, and that I was not receiving from other people. There's a difference between teaching just like at people and actually honoring when people are ready to hear truth. For example, this is my little note for us to recognize. Perhaps we need to do that more in our practice. Perhaps we need to watch out for that as a client. So I continued doing these practices, and one night I had a very bad experience where we had been working on a particular memory. I'm going to give a trigger warning here. If you have trauma, if you feel like you might be triggered by hearing someone else's memory, like abuse experience, please skip ahead just 30 seconds. I'm only going to mention it briefly. So we were working on a particular memory of something that happened when I was younger, when I was a teenager, of being electrocuted through as torture, so repeatedly as torture. And that meant that there was a very painful and a feeling in my body, and emotionally there was a lot of pain of all the thoughts and emotions that would happen if you were being tortured. And we were trying to work on that, and it wasn't closing down properly. And I look back at that and I think, would this have happened if I was with a trained person? Would this have happened if someone had told me, don't do this because this can happen? I don't know. But after the session, this feeling in my body and memory continued, and it just continued and continued and continued. And we were never staying in my window of tolerance, my actual capacity to be grounded and present and feel was very, very tiny, if not completely absent. And, shortening and shortening through the act of continuously flooding myself. We weren't doing titration, as a therapist would call it. So I was left with this memory and this feeling just replaying and replaying, and nothing in that toolbox that we had was helping it. I couldn't, at that time, I didn't feel like, and I couldn't shut it down. So that meant that I actually continued to experience that memory and stuff, and the feelings, for approximately 2-ish days. And obviously that would have been, if you can imagine, it was very, very difficult and painful. And I ended up actually having quite an awakening through that after that kind of, put me to where I am now in many ways. As the memory is continuing, I was at war with myself. And this whole time, I was at war with my mind. I think I was only trying to go deep and push against and kind of ignore my spirit and stuff like that, because I was so like, I just want it to be over. If I just fix it, if I just heal it, okay, heal, heal, heal. It wasn't coming from that actual truly healing place of allowing and accepting and surrendering, and then, transmuting and creating renewal. That's a completely different energy. And a lot of us get in that pattern of trying to fix ourselves when we're in a lot of pain. But it meant for me that I was in an extra huge amount of suffering, and I was kind of at war with my mind. Because we had gone over my limits as well, I didn't kind of consciously realize it, but I was afraid of my mind. I was afraid of the pain. I was afraid of the memories that were there. I was afraid of myself, the self that had gone through that stuff. And I was like healing, but trying to get rid of that. So there was a great war, and there was a great war, and that war emotionally felt like torture. And then that actually sort of feeling an idea of torture acted as a trigger then, or a reminder, as triggers are, for torture memory. And then that wouldn't stop, so that kept going, and I was in a really bad, really bad, really bad night, and I was feeling really suicidal at one point. And there came this moment where I was just like, I still don't quite know how to put it in words, but I felt like I was at war with myself, and the pain was so much that I ended up it felt like something broke, like something cracked open, something shifted. And then awareness, just a different thought, a different voice, a different something, awareness came into my experience that was like completely turbulent and terrible. And I just had the thought, I have to stop believing this or I'm going to die. I have to try to believe something different. Believe the thoughts. So at that time my thoughts were like, this is never going to end, this is just going to keep going, I need to like kill myself, I can't do this, like it's just going to keep going, complete futility. And I had this awareness, I need to believe something different. And so when that awareness came on, I started trying new thoughts, and I was like, this will get better, this will get better, something will be different. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I was trying new thoughts, opposing thoughts. And I think like I must have fallen asleep kind of just praying that in my mind, exhausted. The next day I woke up and the feeling and the pain and the emotion and the body was gone. And I was like amazed and obviously full of relief. And I actually, though, I'll say here, I felt like I had gone through a trauma, though, in that I was so raw and scared, and in a way I did, and I'll mention that in a minute. Um, but then actually, because that had happened, I did feel at the same time good, and like I'd had this realization about thoughts and the power of belief. And then I actually went and did my first teaching event. That was actually the night after. And I think it was just a magical aligning of this awakening to come as I stepped out as a teacher, things like that. You know, Spirit was saying it was an alchemy of my life that happened in that day, that night. And then I was able to go to my teaching event and not be flooded with this and speak about spirit and mention miracles and mean it, things like that. And then it actually led me into after that for a few days, I had a lot of awakenings. I had really intense presence in me that I'll probably talk about in another video, but it changed everything for me and it awakened me. I was fully, in those days, I was fully awakened. Um, and yeah, so that is what happened with me. And after that, I, in part, I had this awareness that this wasn't the right path for me and it had never been the right path. And this awareness that was telling me about different thoughts and thinking different things and stuff started telling me like to do the opposite. So to be just mindfulness, you could say. I didn't use that word because I didn't know what that was. But to observe, to identify, to disidentify, to be here and now, different things like that. To basically do the opposite of what I had been doing. And then what happened next? That was a really good realization and, the positive of that experience. The negative of that was that I felt re-traumatized, and I actually, so clinically speaking, from a therapist perspective, I was re-traumatized. This happens when you flood yourself so much, you go past your limits or your tolerance, that you become, if the client becomes afraid of feeling or afraid of therapy, afraid of the therapist, it can often be they've become re-traumatized by their own trauma, right? So by living that, I had another trauma through reliving that over and over. And so basically developed this weird kind of like PTSD about my trauma and my PTSD. And I became avoidant of feeling and I couldn't reconnect with that person. There was just a part of me that was just saying no, like I can't. Even though it was really painful. And this is another note here, right? Is if your healer is also your friend, if something goes wrong in the healing connection and you have to stop that, you have had an injury to, or in my case, lost both a friend and a healer. So that's extra difficult and extra potentially traumatic. So that's why we stay in our role, okay? There's a lot of grief for me after that, even though things had been going wrong. I didn't see it at the time and I was attached to this person. And it sucked, it was bad. And then I was avoidant of feeling and it took me a long time to be able to feel like it was safe to feel again, to look deeply at my trauma and stuff like that, to look at memories. I just was so scared of getting stuck and flooded like that again. But my therapist worked with me and, it was good from there. So I share this because in our community, there are a lot of people who are working with trauma, okay? And trauma it is inevitable. So like healing or having our wounds, as all humans, we have trauma, okay? It's that loss of connection to who we really are. It's that conditioning and the beliefs and the pain that gets implanted in us. A big T trauma is when the experience is so overwhelming that you don't process it correctly at the time. It goes outside of how or why or within your threshold of being able to process that. And so it lives in our cells, right? That's why things get stuck. And in our spiritual community, as we work with people, we have to be careful when we have, using my example, someone with extreme trauma. You and I am not qualified to help that person in the best, most loving, highest way for them. We can be an adjunct to them. We can support them in other ways. We can be helpful, nurturing, and offer kind of lighter or different things. But you have to know when it is outside of your scope of your services, right? So that's another factor. And what I have been seeing in the spiritual community is people going over that limit or completely not knowing about any of this stuff that I've mentioned already, and people kind of going through what I went through. In bigger ways or smaller ways, with bigger histories of trauma or small trauma history. That doesn't matter. If you go out of the emotional tolerance of somebody and there's no presence, it's damaging to people. And alchemy only happens through presence, through that light of awareness. So I just want to give that to you guys, and you can learn from that, hopefully, all that is put into there. And to just be sure that we're checking in with ourselves about what are we offering to people? What people am I receiving? Where are they on this like spectrum? Do I know how to tell when someone is outside of my services? What are my roles doing? What kind of role am I in people's experience? What are my boundaries that I uphold with all clients no matter what, to keep it safe and consistent for people? What is my understanding of attachment? What is my understanding of projection or transference? That's the clinical term. Or countertransference, or when the healer projects onto the client. What do you do with that? What are your ethics that you follow to keep your clients safe? You know, is there confidentiality that you always honor? Do you casually mention a client's stuff to a friend? Things like this. Clients have the right to privacy, and they have the right to expect that we uphold our responsibility. So all of this, and in my experience, what I took away from my experience was there are people who lack responsibility, and sometimes they just don't see it, and there's an ignorance there, which is not excusable. It's something that we need to talk about though and share, so it's less. And there are also people who are both sort of ignorant or irresponsible, but then become conscious, so no longer ignorant, but still don't want to see that because their ego will be injured if they can't admit that they make a mistake. For example, they enjoy the energy and the feeding off of people's sort of, as I said in the beginning, people giving away their power like too much. They don't want to give that up, and so they can't admit when things are going wrong, and that's really, really dangerous. And we, as the healer or the teacher or whoever you are, we are held to a higher standard, and that standard is so important and sacred, and it comes back to love. It comes back to love. And it is time for us to have a ethical framework that we use in our community. It is time for us to have that conversation to build an ethical framework. And I think that the starting point is to really think about what are your ethics, you know? And as clients, so I'm speaking now for you're like on the receiving end, what do you look for in a teacher or a healer? What feels safe to you? What doesn't? What is your energy saying to you about a certain person? What is the impact of their teachings or their processes in your life? Is your life getting better, you know, or is it getting worse, or is it staying the same? Sometimes you have to watch and wait with that, but you will come to a truth point, you know. Another thing that I have here is just a little thing about sensing. I was kind of asking Spirit, like, how do we sense like a good teacher, an ethical person. I use the word teacher, but again, I mean any healer, practitioner of any kind, even therapists, you know. And one thing that I know that I sense for in spirit was confirmed, sensing heart energy. I realized that part of my injury was the lack of heart energy that was running through these certain people. And now I know that, and you can hear that in the voice. I'm gonna use the example of there's a beautiful teacher called Tara Brach, and when you listen to her voice, maybe that's just me because I'm clairaudient, but I don't know, let me know what you guys think or feel. There is love and compassion in that voice. There are other teachers who, even if they're teaching or offering something that's like a bit hard to swallow or is more shadow work and isn't innately like talking about love and compassion, there's a quality of harmonious resonance within what they're speaking about. There's also a quality of truth that they have a lived experience of what they're talking about or a lived reference point for that. So that tells you that they haven't taken it from someone else, or they're not falsifying things. You also want your healer person or teacher or coach to have respect for the process. So do they have respect for your natural process? Again, there's different ways to look at this, and it is a practice. So like as a healer, you need to offer, what we tend to do is offer like a certain flow or a certain process, a certain container. But I think that we always need to make a room for the individual's process. And that if that piece is missing, maybe looking for if that piece is missing. You know, consider, question, discern, feel. And that reverence that I mentioned, do they have an upholding reverence for who you are? You know, and it may not be in these golden spiritual words that I use, but you know, it's expressed in care and interest in who you are, and just a respect, you know, an honoring of your boundaries, all these different things, safety. Maybe have a sense and feeling for that. And something that I love and I see is very important in spiritual ethics is knowing when not to speak, or knowing when not to give psychic answers. So this more applies to, I guess it applies to everybody. I guess I'll just speak from my reference point, which is being spiritual and having access to other information sometimes. You learn that not only do you just, it's no good for you to just like intuit stuff and kind of tell people truths that they're not ready for, truths that will damage them in the long run, things where you're not invited, your opinion hasn't been invited, things like that. So what it summarizes down to is knowing when not to speak. Some of the best spiritual, like ancient teachers and stuff, there's no words. Part of that is because in spiritual terms, words start to change the meaning of what you're trying to teach. So some things are wordless, and it has to be that way. But a lot of the time they are holding back and refraining to let the student explore for themselves. Let the student feel something that they need to feel first before this truth can then harmoniously and alchemically, you know, be beneficial to them. You know, waiting for divine timing, waiting for spirit's permission, different things like that. A lot of teachers who are not on the ethical path do not wait for spirit's permission or someone's consciousness permission. There's no sensing for readiness, and they just want to dump like excessive truths on people. We do need to face truths, and we choose them when we tune into certain, like if you're watching this, you have chosen, right, to hear this perspective. Yet hopefully you are putting it on through your filter system. Okay, you're kind of just letting it be there, and you're kind of just listening to it, and hopefully you can feel there's no like attacking energy. I'm doing my best to explain things that sometimes it's hard as a very energy person for me to like explain what I see in people, and we're talking about the psychology of people. I'm like, just listen to their sound of their voice and you can hear their heart. I know it's not as easy or simple as that at times. But hopefully you can hear that it's not trying to attack you, it's trying to share with you as an offering. You know, my intention, hopefully, that you feel is always an offering. And you have free choice, you know. When we overtly just sort of put truths on people, we take away that free choice sometimes, and sometimes we're dishonoring the process of where someone is, different things like that. So those are some factors to keep in mind. And then the other things that I mentioned about, you know, is your role clear? Do you feel clear about the boundaries in the sessions or the whatever it is that you have? Do you feel held? Do you feel like you can ask questions and it's okay? Stuff like that. Ultimately, you are the source of truth and you are the source of what is safe and right for you. Like, you're the one that knows. But we can all have this conversation, clients, students, teachers, healers, coaches, to ultimately align to a higher ethical standard. To find alignment. I'm hearing spirit saying alignment, higher alignment. Perhaps that is what we are all really seeking, and what we will endeavor to create and what we are creating through this now. So thank you so much for listening, you guys. Have a think. Let me know in the comments what your experience has been, or if you have any perspectives you want to share. This is a really interesting and important topic. I'd love to hear from you. Remember that you can always check out my services and things on beckluminary.com. And please remember to like, comment, subscribe, donate if that's in your heart to support this channel. And thank you so much for being here.